Hello, my name is Dr. Jacqueline Renishik, and I'm with DTP-Leadership Group. This is Hot Topic Bold Talk. What I want to talk to you about is when Trump tries to erase the facts, the people refuse to disappear or allow the facts to disappear. Now, you're going to say, oh, here she goes again. But this podcast 162, yes, it's once again confronting a truth that is both exhausting and unavoidable. Because Trump does not merely lie, he attacks the very existence of facts. He wages wars on information itself, and he does it so because the facts, the records, the data, and the memories are the last real constraints on raw power. What we're living through right now is not simply a political disagreement, a policy dispute, or even a constitutional crisis in the abstract. It is something more elementary. It is an attempt to rule without evidence, to govern without accountability, and to dominate without shared reality. See, facts bring us to reality. Trump seems to believe that if he can erase the written word, dismantle the data, intimidate witnesses, and flood the public square and flood the public square with fear and confusion, then only his story will remain. That is narcissism elevated into governing philosophy. I want to repeat that again. That is narcissism elevated into governing philosophy. That's what we've got as a president. And it is profoundly dangerous. This episode is not only about destruction, it is also about resistance. Because while the Trump administration is trying to operate in darkness, Americans across the country are turning on the lights. People are documenting, organizing, refusing to look away, standing up even when it carries risk. And nowhere has there been clearer than in Minnesota, where federal power collided with civic courage and blinked. This is a story of a president trying to erase facts and that the country refuses to have them disappear. For decades, one of the quiet pillars of American civic life was the CIA World Factbook. Factbook. It was not flashy. It was not partisan. It was not controversial. It was simply a vast, meticulously curated piece of information about every country on earth: population, geography, economics, government structures, compiled from across the federal government and made freely available to the public. For many Americans, especially elder millennials and Gen X's, as we know them, the World Factbook was a first introduction to the idea of what government could be as a steward of knowledge rather than merely an instrument of power. When it went online in 1997, at a time when the internet itself still felt chaotic and unreliable, the fact books stood out as something rare. It was a source that you could trust. You could cite it in the schools. You could explore the world through it. And there was even something thrilling about the idea that the CIA, an agency synonymous with secrecy, was providing this information openly. And then suddenly it was gone. In a brief online post, the CIA announced that the World Factbook has sunset. No explanation, no justification, no acknowledgement of its public value. The Associated Press later noted that the decision followed a vow by the current CIA director to end programs that did not advance what he defined as the agency's core mission. It's unclear what their core mission is, as far as I'm concerned. That framing alone should trouble anyone who understands democracy, because the World Factbook was not a failure of mission. It was a public service. It informed Americans. It projected soft power abroad. It reinforced the idea that facts belong to everyone, every one of us, not just those in authority. Its disappearance is not just symbolic. It is part of a much broader and far more alarming pattern. The Trump administration's systematic assault on the shared factual basis of democracy, life, is what they are attacking. This is not merely the familiar Trumpian habit of lying or denying reality when it becomes inconvenient. This is something more structural, more deliberate. It is the removal, suppression, and manipulation of information so that citizens no longer have access to the tools they need to evaluate the power that is being exhibited by him. Within the first month of Trump's second term, nearly 3,400 data sets were removed from data.gov. Federal agencies quietly scrubbed or altered information from their websites. CDC, the Census Bureau, and other departments eliminated pages that hosted critical data. In some cases, information was preserved only because non-governmental organizations raced to scrape and archive it before it vanished. But scraping data can only preserve the past. It cannot replace what is never collected in the first place, because Trump doesn't want departments to collect data. And increasingly, data is not being collected continually. Legal scholar Bagenstos and L&D Katz have demonstrated how, and they have documented as well, that the Trump administration has scraped through long-standing obligations to collect and report data related to race, ethnicity, gender, public health, environmental justice, education, and law enforcement. In some cases, the administration simply stopped gathering information. In others, it narrowed or redefined categories, particularly around race and gender identity, so that the discrepancies would become harder to measure, harder to prove, and easier to deny. This may sound absurd, but it is not. When maternal mortality data is not collected, women die without accountability. When opioid use data disappears, communities lose the ability to respond to addiction crisis. When labor statistics are delayed or withheld, as what happened when the Bureau of Labor Statistics failed to release monthly job data for the first time in 77 years. Workers lose leverage, markets lose transparency, and public trust erodes. I listened to an economist today, and it is shocking what the real data is about jobs and what was in 2024 and what's not happening now. It is dramatic, the number of jobs that are not being created because of all the Trump's administration actions. So when education and housing data vanishes, inequality grows quietly. It shields the data from scrutiny. Now, the administration understands exactly what it's doing. Data constrains power. Evidence invites challenge. Records enable lawsuits, journalism, and democratic resistance. So the solution is not to debate the facts, but to erase them. That's what they're doing. This is why the war on information may be even more dangerous than the war on truth. When officials lie, citizens can sometimes see the contradiction. But when information itself disappears, there is nothing left to contest. Democracy requires a shared frame of reference, baselines of facts that allow voters to assess claims and hold leaders accountable. Without that, democracy collapses into competing narratives enforced by power rather than by persuasion. Nowhere has this collapse been more violently exposed than in Minnesota. In late 2025, the Trump administration launched Operation Metro Surge, the largest federal immigration enforcement deployment in American history. Nearly 3,000 heavily armed federal agents, many masked, many dressed in tactical gear, were sent into a city that did not ask for their help. The justification was immigration enforcement. The reality was something else entirely, a city that was placed under siege. Federal agents smashed car windows, dragged people from vehicles, deployed tear gas against protesters, and conducted raids without judicial warrants. Children were detained. We have a 5-year-old that's finally been released because of a judge and what the judge did. Schools saw absenteeism spike as parents kept their children home out of fear. Immigrant-owned businesses shuttered as foot traffic evaporated. Residents organized neighborhood watches, tracked unmarked vehicles, and used messaging apps to warn one another of ICE activity. The entire community was living with the daily anxiety of not knowing who would be taken next or whether they would come home. Then came the killings. On January 7th, Renee Good, a 37-year-old U.S. citizen and mother, was shot and killed by an ICE agent during an operation in southern Minneapolis. Federal officers immediately described the shooting as defensive, alleging she struck an agent with her vehicle. But independent video analysis, witness testimony, and an autopsy findings contradicted that narrative. She had been shot 3 times, including a fatal wound to the head. 17 days later, on January 24th, Alex Pitti, a 37-year-old ICU nurse in Minneapolis, VA Medical Center, was shot and killed by federal agents during another operation. Once again, the official story moved fast. He was labeled as a threat, a domestic terrorist, and an aggressor. But once again, the narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence. Videos from multiple angles showed him as holding a phone, complying with commands, being pepper sprayed, pinned to the ground, and shot from behind. He was a lawful gun owner. He was not attacking anyone. 2 U.S. citizens, 2 killed, 1 unmistakable that we have a pattern now of what Trump is willing to do. They were labeled. They justified the force. They delayed accountability indefinitely. However, it was brought into the light because of people that were there filmed what happened on their phones. This pattern is not accidental. It is a strategy. By defining victims as threats before facts are established, the administration seeks to lock in permission for violence and foreclose scrutiny. Scrutiny, when it's done, gives us factual data. They are doing everything they can so they will not be scrutinized. But we as citizens can do something about it. We can film, we can do so many things. Once the label hardens that they're a terrorist or whatever, accountability becomes harder to reach. Investigations narrow, evidence disappears, and the public is told not to believe its own eyes. That is why phones terrify authoritarian power. In both the Minneapolis killings, the government's story unraveled because ordinary people filmed what they saw. Citizens documented with their cell phones, held by bystanders, became the most powerful check on federal force. And that is precisely why recording the government is increasingly treated as provocative. When filming becomes a crime, accountability suffocates. A democracy cannot survive if witnessing state power becomes too dangerous to attempt. The administration tried to act in the dark. Minnesota and Minneapolis refused. Residents organized mutual aid networks. Volunteers escorted children to school. Neighbors delivered groceries to families afraid to leave their homes. Protesters gathered outside federal buildings, chanting shame as agents came and went. Lawyers filed lawsuits. Journalists documented relentlessly. Local officials refused cooperation, citing statutory laws and constitutional limits. Mayor Jacob Frey, caught between a federal government intent on coercion and a city demanding protection, drew a line. Minneapolis police would not participate in immigration enforcement, not because of ideology alone, but because federal overreach was destabilizing the city itself. This is not about safety, Frey said. This is a political narrative they're trying to concoct. The pressure worked. Under mounting public outrage, legal scrutiny, and political backlash, the administration adjusted. Federal leadership was reshuffled. Border Patrol officers, particularly one who is I think he's just outrageously bigoted and racist. But he was the public face of the operation. He was removed. Tom Homan announced that 700 agents would withdraw from the city. The rhetoric softened. Body cams were promised. Polls showed overwhelming public skepticism of the administration's claims and tactics. This was not a moral awakening. It was a way to show what was happening through the pressure the administration tried to carry out. And he revealed something critically important. Even this administration, with all its contempt for norms and law, can be constrained when people refuse to accept manufactured certainty as truth. At the same time, Trump's assault on democracy has expanded beyond policing and immigration into the electoral system itself. With 9 months to go before the midterms, the administration has escalated efforts and it stated very clearly that election officials and legal experts describe as deeply alarming. The Department of Justice has demanded voter rolls from dozens of states without statutory authority. The FBI has conducted searches tied to defunct theories of 2020 election fraud. Trump has openly floated the idea of nationalizing elections, an assertion of power the federal government does not possess. Redistricting has become another battlefield. Trump and his allies have pushed aggressive mid-decade gerrymandering in states like Texas, Missouri, and North Carolina, attempting to lock in power before voters can respond. When Republicans in Indiana joined Democrats to reject an extreme gerrymander, despite threats of violence and retaliation, the White House vowed payback. The message was unmistakable: defy us, and we will come for you. Yet even here, resistance is growing. Democrats have overperformed in special elections. A deep red state, Texas, had a major change in a state Senate district, which flipped by a stunning margin for Democrats. Polls show voters increasingly disillusioned with Trump's economic promises and immigration tactics are taking action. House Republicans openly acknowledge their vulnerability. Trump himself has begun lowering expectations, often the sign of an anticipated defeat. What ties all of this together is a growing philosophy rooted in power without accountability, which he's been running all along, Trump has. Administrative subpoenas are weapons to intimidate critics. Immigration law is distorted to punish the poor while selling gold card visas to the wealthy for $1 million. Federal agencies are deployed not to serve the public, but to coerce obedience. Rights become conditional. Truth becomes optional. Loyalty becomes enforced. This is not democracy. It is authoritarianism draped and patriotic language. I've said it many times. This is what's happening. And yet, the most important story of this moment is not Trump's appetite for control. It is the refusal of Americans to surrender their decency, their memory, and their sense of law. Minnesota showed us all something very vital, not a perfect model, not a heroic myth, but a living example of how democratic resistance actually works. It's decentralized, it's imperfect, it's grounded in neighborhoods and in courage of the people in those neighborhoods. People did not wait for permission. They did not wait for saviors. They documented, they organized, they pressured, they refused to forget what was happening. The resistance is sometimes not loud. Often it looks like a grandmother blowing a whistle outside a school, a nurse kneeling at a memorial, a business owner who locks the doors to protect customers inside, and a citizen holding up a phone. Trump believes that if he erases the facts, he can rule the story. We must demand that we have the CAI Factbook again, and it has to be updated. Trump is wrong. Facts live in people, memories live in communities, and power, no matter how ruthless, still fears the truth when enough people insist on seeing it, recording it, and speaking it aloud. The real question now is not whether this administration will try again. It will. The question is whether the rest of the country is paying attention and whether we will continue to demand facts, law, and humanity and human dignity to all people when those in power demand silence. I had often given up on Texas. Now, I happened to live for many, many years in Houston. I moved to Pearland. But I still pay attention to everything happening in Houston. And we are a democratic city. And to watch a red section of my state elected Democratic senator is amazing. And he knew he could win because of all the discontent and disillusionment about Trump. We have to pay attention to what happened in Minneapolis, all over Minnesota. And whether we will continue or not, we have to demand facts, law, and respect for all human beings. We cannot be silenced because if there are no facts, there is no democracy. And if we refuse to disappear and use our phones or anything else we can to support each other, then we will have truth in America. If you appreciate what I'm doing in my podcast, then please support me on Patreon. It's a very small amount of $5 on a monthly basis, and it gives me an opportunity to continue with what I'm trying to present you, to educate you about what's going on. I hope you have found this particular podcast very informative. And I hope it is thought-provoking because the facts and the data, whether it's about science, whether it's about politics, whether it's about countries, whatever it's about, it is very important. That's the reason our libraries are being attacked by them, because our libraries have been places where people could learn and understand what is truly happening. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast.